Today we're going to talk about hip mobility for beginners, and we're going to look at two positions specifically, one primary and one secondary. The primary one is hip extension, and then the secondary one is hip internal rotation. So when I do my hip mobility workshops, these are the two positions that I find people that are most limited in. Now, it can also be a case that there is some back pain involvement as well. But if you have back pain, please do click a link below and you go through to my How to Overcome Lower Back Pain consultation and coaching if that's what you need. But if you are working on your hip mobility, then please go through and just click the link below, which is my hip mobility workshop, which is a 2-hour workshop where we get you in and get your hips more mobile for everyday life, for squatting, for deadlifting, and whatever you need it for. As I mentioned, we're going to be working on two specific positions, hip extension and hip internal rotation. So what we're going to do is we're going to follow what is basically my 3-step process that I tend to follow, which is massage, stretch, and move. Now, with regards to the massage, we're going to be using a foam roller and potentially what is called an orb ball, but you can use any kind of ball. These are really good because they're of a decent size, that they're not too small that you kind of it gets lost on you, but also they're big enough that you can get stuck into certain joints as well, or certain tissues as well. So what we're going to be doing with regards to the foam roller, or foam rolling, is we're going to be working on the front of the hip and the side of the hip. Because what we're looking to do with regards to hip extension is we want the ability to go into this position without arching the back. Because when a lot of people go into positions, and we'll talk about this when we get to the stretch, is when people extend, they'll tend to tilt the pelvis. What we want to try and do is keep the pelvis in place and just extend at the hip, because that's what's going to activate the glute. If we just come into this sort of position here where we're all arched, the glute switches off. But as soon as we get the pelvis and extend the hip, the glute goes solid. So we get a much better stability and power from the hip when we get into that position. But first of all, what we've got to do is get into that anterior part of the hip. So what we do, now we're not going to go all the way down the thigh. We're just going to go sort of midway down the thigh. We could include rectus femoris, but what we're going to do is we're going to aim for sort of the top half of the thigh and onto the hip. So we come onto here, and basically we're just rolling through. Now we would start off, or I would start off with anyone, just rolling through that front part and just kind of going up and down what would be with the direction of the muscle, as it were. So just to get the tissues loose, then we would focus on that sort of front part of the hip, and again spend a little bit more time in here because these are the tissues that we want to be really focusing on. So we would focus on just getting that open, and again just focusing on sort of right to the inside, but then working all the way to the outside, so keeping that as smooth as possible. What we can then do is go across the fibers. So we've done with the fibers, for example. Now we're going to go across. So this is going to open it up in a whole new way, and potentially it's going to feel a little bit more tender. So all we're doing is we're just going sort of backward, or sorry, side to side over the thigh, but then just move up an inch and then just do exactly the same. Just going over, and then when we get to the hip, again we can go right round on that front portion of the hip. Now there is no reason why, if you've got a foam roller you can use that, but also we can use this ball here. So if I do that on the other side, now this, again I would go up and down, but what it does give me a license to do is be a little bit more specific about where I go, because I can move it up, down, side to side, I can do circles, and I can just play around with it that much more, and it's much easier to move on. Plus, it's a smaller contact point, so you can really get stuck in to little grooves within the muscle and just get stuck in there. Open it out. So now I'm right up in the hip. I'm coming right across onto the outside of the hip and just holding in here and just getting stuck in as much as I can. So hopefully you can sort of see where I am. Right now, I'm above the hip, where the hip joint sits in into the pelvis. I'm above that, and then you've got the iliac crest at the top. I'm in between that little gap, going right through glute medius. And if I can get close enough, I can go into glute minimus as well. So if I come this way, if I can find the top of the femur, so the femoral neck, and where it joins into the pelvis, that's my glute minimus. And then I can get stuck in there, try and relax this leg as well, and just really work in there. And then you may find some tender spots that are really useful to get into. Now again, we've been doing this for a couple of minutes, or I've been doing this for a couple of minutes, and there's no reason why you can't do that and just go searching for any tight spots, tender spots, and just try and work them through. So we're just getting stuck in, opening it all through and opening it all out. And then what we can do is, once we've gone through that whole of the sort of top half of the thigh and around that inside, front to outside of the hip, then we're in a position now to start stretching through. And what we're going to do is we're going to go into two stretches. The two stretches that we're going to focus on are a hip extension stretch and a hip internal rotation stretch. So we'll start with hip extension. Now, as I mentioned at the start, it's very important to keep the pelvis in position, because we're going to come down onto one knee. We're going to get the pelvis into position first. So we want to not just, when we lean in, we don't just want to lean in and let everything go, because now I've arched my spine, my glutes off, and I may well get a stretch down here, but it won't be as effective as it could be. So what we do is we come in, we get the glutes switched on, and we get the pelvis in place. What we then do, once we've got that, is we maintain that, and then, again, if I just take a slightly bigger stride, and then we go in and really get the glute, keep the glute active. So keep that on, keep the pelvis in position. You can literally, with your hands, sort of hold it in position, not quite literally, but you know what I mean. I'm sort of pulling up this hand and pushing down this one, feeling that my glute's still on, but now I've got a great stretch going right down through the front of my thigh, top of my hip. I can feel it just on the inside, on the top of my knee as well. But I'm just in there and I'm holding. Now again, there will be no reason why you can't hold that for 1, 2, possibly even 3 minutes if you chose to. If I come onto the other side, it's exactly the same. We come in, get the pelvis in position, get the spine in position, get upright, and then lean into that extension. Again, we're not looking to go far. We don't need to go far. You just need to go far and find that stretch. But the important bit, get the pelvis in position, get the glute active, and then lean forward into it. Once you've got that, you're then in a position to start really not only stretching and extending the hip, but again, getting it functioning properly with a good glute activation as well. So not only is it stretching here, it's getting you to think about activating the glutes. So when it comes to doing some exercise where you require like a squat or a deadlift, when you go into the extension, you know what that glute feels like. And also, if you're doing it on one side than the other, it's much harder than if you're doing them both together as well. So that single leg nature to it is only going to be helpful for you. So the hip extension stretch is this, just on one knee, just pushing through. What we've then got is the second stretch. So we've now got the internal rotation part to it. Now this is a very, again, simple stretch where we're going to lie on our backs. We're going to bend one leg, so I've bent this leg. I'm then going to take this leg across, and then I'm going to go into that internal rotation. So you will get a little bit of hip extension with it, but you may just come around this sort of outside of the hip. Now again, with regards to stretching, I tend not to be too specific about muscles that are working, and I just think about areas that should be working. But if you find that your stretch is slightly different to where I'm saying, then as long as you're in the position, we know we're getting the right stretch. And then you just use the weight of this leg to push this knee towards the floor. And you can be active here, so I'm actively pushing this ankle into the knee to push it towards the floor. And again, it's just giving me a nice stretch wherever I need it. And then I'm just holding there, and then again, it's just a case of coming across, again using that leg just pushing down and just getting that stretch all the way through. Now this one feels different to the other side. Now it's going around on sort of the inside of the hip there. So again, the position's the same, but the stretch is different. So that's kind of the experience that you may have as well. Now we've got two exercises. They're both sort of mobilizing exercises, one of them more so than another. One uses the muscles a little bit more as a normal exercise that we could describe it as. So the first one that we're going to do is just some simple wipers, from the hip. So we sit on the floor, hands behind like so, and then it's just a case of dropping. We're mainly, because we're working on the internal rotation, it's mostly this leg that we want to be focusing on. So it's keeping the shoulders and the head as far forward as well, because if we come here and we take the torso around, we lose what we're trying to gain here. So if we keep the shoulders pointing forward and the head forward, then we just come up and over, and then we go down the other side again. It's sort of my left leg at the moment, that is really being challenged, and then we come over, and again we're just going either side, getting the knee as close to the floor as we can. If we can get to the floor, great, but we still want to keep them mobile. So exercise number one is just really getting down in there. We may use sort of 10, 12, 16, 20 reps, whatever it may be, but just really opening out and just getting as much mobility through the hip as we can. Again, as I mentioned, keeping the shoulders, the chest, and the head facing forward, and let the hip do the rotation. The second exercise, so that's more of the mobility part of it, because there's not a lot of muscle activation in that. It is just a case of just trying to get the knees as close to the floor as possible. This second exercise is slightly different, because what we're going to be doing is this is a little bit more active, and we're going to come into what would be described as a deficit lunge. So I'm going to have one foot on a raised surface. This could be a step. Obviously, this is a sort of an aerobic step that we've got here, but it could just be a step at home. It could be a chair. It could be anything. It could be a little wall if you've got one out in your garden, whatever. But basically, you just need something to raise your foot up. What we're then going to do is come into this hip extension. So we want some good extension here. Again, we want to get glute on and pelvis in position. And because we've stretched somewhat, we should be able to get a little bit more extension. If you can't, then just come into this position where you haven't got quite as much extension. But if you can, get the glute on, the pelvis in, and then we lunge down into it. Again, I'm using my hand here so I can feel my glute. I've got my pelvis in position, and I'm lunging down in. So I'm just trying to anchor my foot with my toe, but then as I lunge down, I'm extending the hip. So it's just a little bit more active, more so on this leg, to come down and then push back out. Again, get the glute on, come down, get the stretch, and come back up. So really working hard to get down into that position, whilst the same as the hip stretch, to get a good activation of the hip, get the pelvis in position, and then you get that much more of a stretch. But we're mobilizing it because we're using the reps to go in and out of the exercise. Many thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed the content, please do like and subscribe. Click the bell icon and you'll be notified when my next tutorial comes out. If you are struggling with your hip mobility and you do want some help, and you're in the UK and you want to come to the gym, work face-to-face with me, click the link below, go through to my hip mobility workshop. It's a 2-hour workshop where we basically work through consultation, assessment I'll find out about your hips and ask you questions what you want to achieve. We'll assess the hips, find out where we are with them, and then we'll start building a program to put together. And then what will happen at the end is I will then take that information away, I'll write it all up for you and send it to you via email. So you've got that specific hip mobility program for you to start developing your hip mobility.